Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to look at solipsism. In particular, I'm going to look at the argument that there is experimental evidence against solipsism. This is presented by Eric Schwitzgebel and Alan Moore from Schwitzgebel's book The Weirdness of the World. So let's start with some definitions. So metaphysical solipsism is the view that my own mind is all that exists. This is a claim about what there is in the world. Epistemic solipsism is the view that my own mind is all that can be known to exist. I mean, maybe there are other things in other minds, but I have no way to establish that. Based on the evidence available to me, I should not infer the existence of anything other than my own mind. Now, Schwitzgebel and Moore focus specifically on what they call radical solipsism, which they define as follows. They say, my conscious mind is the only thing in the universe. There are no material objects, no other minds, not even a hidden unconscious side of myself, no external world of any sort. So more moderate forms of solipsism might allow that, my mind has unconscious processes going on. Radical solipsism denies even this. There is only my conscious experience, nothing more, not even any kind of unconscious mind. And again, radical solipsism can be taken as a metaphysical hypothesis that my own conscious mind is all that exists, or as an epistemic hypothesis that my own conscious mind is all that can be known to exist. Schwitzgebel and Moore's argument works against both the metaphysical and epistemic versions of radical solipsism. They are going to argue that we can find evidence, there is evidence that more that exists than just my own conscious experience. Of course, I'm framing this in terms of my own conscious experience, but if you are watching this, you should be thinking of this in terms of your own conscious experience. Solipsism says that your own mind is all that exists, or for radical solipsism, your own conscious mind is all that exists, right? Now, there are, of course, already a number of arguments against solipsism. Many philosophers believe that solipsism is just incoherent. Perhaps, for example, it presupposes a notion of a private language that Wittgenstein has supposedly refuted, or perhaps, as Donald Davidson argues, it just follows from the very nature of belief that most of our beliefs are correct about an external world. I mean, if these sorts of views are right, okay, solipsism doesn't even make any sense. But, these kinds of arguments are all very controversial, and, intuitively at least, solipsism, it seems like an epistemic possibility. It seems like it's coherent. We might wonder, in fact, I suppose the natural reaction when you first hear about solipsism is to wonder whether there can be any evidence against it. Schwitzgebel and Moore propose that there is indeed evidence against it. I can know that there's more than just my own conscious mind. I can't really know much about what this further thing is, at least not on the basis of their argument. But there is evidence against solipsism. There's an important point here, I suppose, about the strategy that we use in arguing against solipsism. Maybe there is a successful argument which shows that solipsism is completely incoherent. But as Schwitzgebel and Moore say, and I quote, none of these responses seems preferable to actually delivering a non-question begging proof if such proof is discoverable. To say that solipsism is incoherent is what Schwitzgebel and Moore call a fallback maneuver. So basically it's like, look, I encounter solipsism, it seems like it makes sense, and then I ask, well, what's the evidence against it? And a fallback maneuver is basically a way of responding, well, you don't really need evidence, or at least you don't need the kind of evidence you think you need. A fallback maneuver tries to show that, you can't respond to solipsism in the way that you might respond to ordinary challenges. So when I ask, for example, what evidence is there that ghosts aren't real? Well, here we can present the supposed evidence for and against ghosts, and I might receive an answer that satisfies my request for evidence. A fallback maneuver, by contrast, says that there's something illegitimate about the very request for evidence. And I think Schwitzgebel and Moore's point here is that, even if this is true, even if solipsism is actually just incoherent, so there's no need to ask for evidence, it's a little bit unsatisfying. And I think the thing is that, look, solipsism seems very easy to at least imagine. Like, as a logical possibility, it seems like, yeah, I mean, maybe there is just nothing but my own mind. And one might here draw analogies to the sort of experiences that you have in, like, dreams or hallucinations. There's a kind of plausible way of looking at dreams where it's like a dream involves an experience as of a world, but there actually is no such world corresponding to it, and so then you kind of might naturally think, well, why does there ever need to be a world corresponding to my experience? On the other hand, the philosophical arguments that allegedly demonstrate the incoherence of solipsism are often, surprising or technical, and they all rest on very controversial claims about, meaning and thought and concepts. So it is natural to wonder, well, what if Wittgenstein is wrong? What if Davidson is wrong? Meaning is a very tricky concept, and it wouldn't be surprising if our views about it changed significantly in the future. But if the refutation of solipsism appealed to some refuted theory of meaning, well, you're left with nothing. It would therefore be nice to have ordinary evidence against solipsism. So I guess this is why Schwitzgebel and Moore think that there's some use in what they're doing. Okay, so Schwitzgebel and Moore are going to take the coherence of solipsism for granted and ask whether there's ordinary evidence against it. In this respect, they're taking their cue from Bertrand Russell. Russell's response to solipsism was that while we can't conclusively prove that it's incorrect, the evidence weighs against it in the sense that the hypothesis of an external world provides a simpler explanation of experience than solipsism does. So we have these two competing hypotheses, right? There's radical solipsism, which says there's nothing more than my own conscious experience, and then there's the external world hypothesis, which just says something exists outside my conscious experience. Of course, this is very vague, doesn't specify what that something is. It might be a bunch of material objects, it might just be part of my unconscious mind, right? So it's not the external world in the ordinary sense, but it's just there's something outside my conscious experience. These are the two hypotheses on the table. Now, in principle, all of the patterns of my experience are logically consistent with radical solipsism. So I can't rule out radical solipsism conclusively, but I can still evaluate these two theories in terms of which provides the best explanation of these patterns that I find in my experience. I can think, all right, well, we can look at what these theories say, and then I can look at what my patterns of experience are, and I can say, okay, which is most compatible with the data. I mean, one of these might be simple and powerful, the other might require kind of bizarre ad hoc hypotheses that seem very unnatural. So radical solipsism is here being treated like an empirical scientific hypothesis. Which of these hypotheses does the best job of accounting for the evidence? Now, in order to test radical solipsism like this, we need to be clear about what exactly radical solipsism allows, because obviously much of the data that we would ordinarily use to test a standard scientific hypothesis is going to be off the table. Because the radical solipsist doesn't think that that there's an external world. So we can't just presuppose that, we can't just say, well, look, I have this graph, where a graph is supposedly something that's been, created by some sort of instrument in the external world. We obviously can't presuppose that. That would just be to beg the question against radical solipsism. We can't assume that there's any kind of external world at all. So what can we assume? Well, Schwitzgebel and Moore take it that the radical solipsist can still believe in the following things. First, there is introspective knowledge. There's knowledge of what is going on in my own stream of consciousness. So I can know my own thoughts, my feelings, my sensations. I can know that I have sensory experiences. I can't know, for example, that I have hands, but I can know that there is a visual appearance as of hands, right? there's like some kind of thing happening in the sensory data that I'm saying, oh, that looks like a hand, right? Second, there are memories of past experiences, and those memories can be trusted to be reliable. The radical solipsist isn't going to want to rule out the idea that I might have reliable memories of my own past experiences. Third, there are concepts and categories which may be more or less appropriate to the stream of experiences. I can group certain things together. For instance, I can identify various different visual appearances that all get grouped under the category red, or different tactile experiences that all get grouped under the category sharp. And then I can recognize these things going forward, like I can recognize red things reliably. Finally, I have general reasoning abilities. I can weigh up different hypotheses, I can assess which is better, I can rely on general epistemic principles of theory choice, such as simplicity, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. So, prima facie, none of this assumes that there's anything beyond my own mind. At least not, again, at face value, none of this is assuming anything more than just my own stream of experience. So radical solipsism is not radical skepticism, right? There's a number of things that we can take for granted in trying to test the radical solipsist hypothesis. And that's important, because if there wasn't anything that we could take for granted, then obviously we wouldn't be able to do anything to assess it. If you weren't able to take for granted epistemic principles like simplicity, then it would just make no sense to even embark on this project of testing these theories. So what then does radical solipsism predict? What does it say the world will be like? Or what does it say? Rather, what does it say experience will be like? Well, here's a first idea, which Schwitzgebel and Moore don't endorse, but I think it's worth considering. So there's a thought that some people have, even some philosophers have this thought, that solipsism predicts that I will be able to control my own experiences, that I would have full control. If nothing exists beyond my mind and my conscious experiences, the thought is, well, I should be able to just control what happens. In which case, if solipsism does indeed predict this, the test is very simple. I can just will something to happen and check whether it happens. So I can pick up a deck of cards, I can will myself to produce a 3 of clubs, and then if I draw anything else, solipsism is falsified. This test obviously will show very frequently that solipsism is falsified, because there's all sorts of things that I will to happen that do not happen. Now, the problem with this, Schwitzgebel and Moore say, is that, well, solipsism actually just doesn't imply that there's any control over one's own stream of experience. All solipsism claims is that there is only the stream of experience. So there might be all kinds of patterns in this stream of experience that have no relation to your desires and goals. One way to think about this is to note that it might well turn out that there is unpredictability or uncontrollability or whatever in the material world. If certain interpretations of quantum mechanics are correct, then it may well turn out that at a fundamental level there are unpredictable and genuinely indeterminate events that just are in principle uncontrollable. But that wouldn't force us to postulate immaterial entities that are somehow behind the material world. So similarly, unpredictable, random, uncontrollable events in your stream of experience do not force you to postulate anything beyond your experience. Now, I think this is perhaps a little bit too quick, though. I think there might be something still to be said for this idea about, maybe radical solipsism does predict that experience should be controllable. Because I think the problem is this. Here's what I think the critic of solipsism is getting at here. If I can't control my own experiences, then this implies that there must be some sort of constraint on my experiences. And it really doesn't seem like that constraint is being consciously experienced. So with respect to the cards, for example, I had no conscious experience that there was any constraint on my experience relating to the cards, at least prior to playing with the cards. So my initial expectation is, I'll be able to will my stream of experience to produce the visual appearance of a 3 of clubs when I take the card out, right? That's my initial expectation. So then I take a card out and I find that my expectation was wrong. So it looks like I now have to postulate there's some sort of law that's governing my experience where this law was not consciously accessible to me. And now it looks like we have something beyond conscious experience, and radical solipsism is falsified. The constraining force, the law governing experience that prevented me from being able to will the 3 of clubs, that's something outside of my experience. And that's why I had no idea initially that I would not be able to make the 3 of clubs happen. So, I think that this objection is not quite right. And I think it's really going to depend on your conception of what the laws of nature are. So I have a video on laws of nature, which I will link in the comments, which outlines this in more detail. But broadly speaking, there are two conceptions of laws. There are necessitarianism and Humeanism. So according to necessitarianism, laws of nature are they're like underlying principles that govern the events and processes in the world. So to say that it's a law of nature that, for instance, nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light, this is to say that there's some sort of principle that necessitates that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light. There's something about the world that makes it the case that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light. As the necessitarian sees it, the laws of nature tell us how the world must behave, right? By contrast, on the Humean view, laws of nature are nothing more than regularities or uniformities in the world. It's a law of nature that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light. This is to say nothing more than that, as a matter of fact, there are no objects that accelerate beyond the speed of light. But that's all. The Humean does not take it that there's anything that makes it the case that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light, or that there's any kind of governing principle underlying the operation of the world. A law of nature tells us how the world in fact behaves, and that's it. Laws are just patterns, right? There's nothing more to the law that nothing exceeds the speed of light than the fact that every particular object never exceeds the speed of light. Again, you can check out the video I mentioned for more detail on this, but the key thing is, it does seem clear that radical solipsism has to reject the necessitarian conception of laws. That there can't be necessitarian laws of experience. Necessitarian laws of experience would imply some sort of principles governing experience, and those are not going to be consciously accessible. But if we go for a Humean conception of laws, and there are independent reasons to favour a Humean conception of laws, there are plenty of people attracted to this way of thinking about laws, well then we don't need to postulate anything beyond patterns in consciously accessible experience. When I will to produce a 3 of clubs and I instead draw a 6 of diamonds, that's just a brute pattern of experience. There's not like some sort of constraining principle or constraining force, but why should there be? Why shouldn't there just be some pattern whereby I first have the experience of willing a sensory experience of X, and then I have the sensory experience of not X, right? Experience is sometimes non-compliant with what I will. That's just the way that experience is organized, and that's it. There's no reason why it's non-compliant. It just is that way. Similarly, a Humean who believes in the external world, they might say, look, hydrogen atoms sometimes bond with oxygen atoms. That's just it. That's just a way that things are organized. There's not like some law necessitating this standing behind that. Okay then, just a quick advert here. If you want to give me some money, you can join my Patreon. There's a bunch of bonus videos available there, so you can check that out. Obviously, any cash you can give me helps keep the channel going, or you could just send a donation on PayPal. I obviously really appreciate anything you can offer, and it helps me keep the videos coming regularly. If you like what I do, please consider donating. All right. Let's move on. So let's turn then. So I'm going to assume then that the solipsist is not refuted with the easy method of just, willing something and then having that fail to happen, in which case we can turn to Schwitzgebel and Moore's experiments. So they proposed 3 experiments. I'm not going to talk about, I won't talk about the third one because I think that's actually just quite similar to the first, but I'll talk about 2 of them. So each of these experiments generates conflicting predictions from radical solipsism and from the external world hypothesis. So the first thought is, since radical solipsism holds that there's only my conscious experience, one of the things that we would expect, one of the things that follows, it's not just that we expect it just directly follows from radical solipsism, is that there are no entities that have reasoning powers greater than my own. So this point inspires Schwitzgebel and Moore's first experiment. Alright, so here's how the experiment works. First of all, Schwitzgebel programs Microsoft Excel to calculate whether a 4-digit number is prime. And if so, it displays prime next to the number. If not, it displays non-prime. Now, of course, so far, there's no assumption that there really are computers or that there really is a Microsoft Excel program. This is just a useful description of the pattern of experiences that is occurring to Schwitzgebel's mind. Okay, so you have to, I'm using ordinary language to communicate this, but you can rephrase this so that it's just framed in terms of patterns of experiences. But anyway, so first of all, you program Microsoft Excel to calculate whether a number is prime or non-prime. Okay, so then the experiment goes like this. He then asks Excel to generate 20 random numbers between 1,000 and 4,000, excluding numbers divisible by 2, 3, and 5. So a good portion of the generated numbers should be prime. Next, Schwitzgebel takes his best guess at which of these 20 numbers is prime, allowing for about 2 seconds for each guess. Then he pastes the prime numbers into the Excel prime number calculator function. So the program will now list prime and non-prime next to the numbers. And so now we have, on the one hand, Schwitzgebel's guesses about which numbers are prime, and on the other hand, we have the Excel calculator saying which numbers are prime. And then finally, Schwitzgebel will determine which among the 20 numbers are actually prime by mental calculation. So then he can check whether the apparent, Excel results are accurate. And he does this with both Arabic numerals and Roman numerals. So there's 2 runs of this test. All right, now if radical solipsism is true, and there is nothing more than my conscious experience, I should expect that the Excel-generated answers about which numbers are prime will not generally be more accurate than my own best guesses. If they are more accurate, that would suggest that there exists something with reasoning powers greater than my own. Now, that doesn't prove that there's an external world in any ordinary sense. Maybe the thing with greater reasoning powers is my own conscious mind. Maybe the thing with greater reasoning powers is some sort of evil demon, whatever. The thing is that, moderate solipsism, the view that there's just my mind, but there's maybe like unconscious parts of it, that's still on the table. But we would have evidence against radical solipsism. We would say there's something beyond my own conscious experience. So how did this work out in Schwitzgebel's case? Well, by mental calculation, Schwitzgebel was able to confirm the machine results in 19 of 20 cases, although he points out he later updates this to 20 of 20 cases after he found a long division error in one of his calculations. But he confirmed his best guess judgment in only 11 of the 20 cases. For the run with Roman numerals, he confirmed the machine result in all 20 cases again, while his best guess was correct in only 13 cases. So this is a difference that's very unlikely to be due to chance. So the evidence suggests that yes, something exists that has greater reasoning powers than Schwitzgebel's conscious mind. At the instant that Schwitzgebel dragged down the Excel function, this thing, it seemed, something beyond Schwitzgebel's conscious mind, performed a rapid calculation of which Schwitzgebel wasn't conscious. Now, of course, nothing that's been said here should be convincing to you, but you could easily copy this experiment, and the expectation is that you would have similar results. Now, this does not refute radical solipsism. doesn't conclusively refute it. I mean, it's possible that it is mere coincidence that the Excel numbers are just more accurate by chance, but this data is very unlikely to be just chance. So chance is a very poor explanation here. How else might the solipsists respond to this data? Well, one thing that we've noted is that solipsism does allow for there to be patterns within experience. For example, when I have the visual appearance of a cylindrical object and then I reach out and touch it, I have a related tactile experience. There is a correspondence between certain types of visual appearances and certain types of tactile appearances. Or consider how, when I look at a bright object, the visual appearance is followed by an after image of a complementary colour. Bright red objects are followed by green after images. So there can be these general patterns, these general laws in the Humean sense, Humean laws that relate certain experiences to other experiences, which means that the results of experiment 1 could follow from a general law of experience. But Schwitzgebel and Moore point out that this law of experience would have to be extremely strange. So as they say, there would have to be an unmediated relationship between, on the one hand, the visual appearance of, for example, the numeral 2837 in apparent black Calibri 11-point font in an apparent Excel spreadsheet, accompanied by the inner speech experience of saying to myself with understanding 2837 in English, and on the other hand, the visual experience of suddenly seeing prime in the matched column to the right if the number is prime and seeing non-prime otherwise. Alright, this hypothesis is highly artificial and ad hoc, right? I mean, so it's like, yes, you know, we can appeal to this hypothesis to make radical solipsism consistent with the data that we have found, but it's a very strange and unnatural law, and this law is being constructed specifically to deal with what initially was recalcitrant data that did not conform to the more natural original prediction, where the original prediction was that you wouldn't expect the Excel to be correct at a greater rate than you are consciously. The basic problem here is that nothing about the visual experience of seeing, for instance, 1867 seems to share anything more in common with the visual experience of 3023, and these are both numbers that are prime, than it does with the visual experience of 1367, which is non-prime, right? So 1867 doesn't seem to have anything more in common with 3023, which are both prime numbers, than it does with 1367, which is a non-prime number. What seems to be unifying 1867 and 3023 is a semantic feature, namely the primeness of the numbers. But of course that is not present in conscious experience prior to calculating whether the numbers are prime. So that's not going to be playing a role in the solipsist explanation. I mean, it just really looks like what's going on here is that there was some sort of thing that you weren't consciously aware of that had better prime detection abilities. That's a much more natural hypothesis. Here is Schwitzgebel and Moore's second experiment. This involves a kind of memory test. So to set this up, Schwitzgebel tells Moore, or I mean more accurately, seeming Moore, to create a procedure that generates apparently arbitrary 3-digit numbers and another procedure that generates apparently arbitrary sets of 3 letters. Now it's important that the numbers and letters are not actually random. They need to be generated by a procedure that can be repeated. So for the numbers, for instance, you could use the decimal expansion of a 4-digit fraction, such as I have given here. I'm not going to say all of that, but that's an example that you could use. Okay, so then the test goes like this. In the first test, Moore presents to Schwitzgebel a series of 20 3-digit numbers by speaking the numbers. So he speaks this set of 3-digit numbers. Then Schwitzgebel first attempts to just freely recall the numbers that were just listed. And then he also attempts to identify the 20 presented numbers from a list of 40 numbers, half of which are new numbers. So these are just 2 different versions of him basically trying to remember these 3-digit numbers. Then next, Schwitzgebel is presented again with the original list of numbers, this time visually, by being shown the original written list. And of course he can cross-check his answers against this list. And finally, Schwitzgebel is told the procedure that's used to generate the list of numbers. So he can confirm that this visual presentation of the list that he's given matches what was the auditory presentation of the list earlier, because he can test whether the visually presented list was indeed generated by the procedure that has been claimed. So you can do this test with numbers, and then of course you can also do this test with letters. Now, I mean, the result, of course, is Schwitzgebel is told that he has not recalled the numbers and letters perfectly. Now, here's the point. If there is nothing beyond one's conscious experience, the natural prediction is that the represented list, when you visually look at the list, that should not contain a greater number of the originally presented elements than would be generated by chance. The contents of experience should not have a fixity that exceeds that of my memory, because nothing exists beyond my own experience to do the fixing. So the point is, you're presented with this list of numbers, right? And then you forget what a bunch of those numbers are. And then you're presented with a list of numbers again later, where that second list of numbers matches perfectly the original list. And then the question is, how on earth was that content retained over time? How did that happen? Given that there's nothing more than your conscious experience, and you could no longer consciously remember the numbers. It seems like there's something, what it suggests is there's something in the beyond your conscious experience that retained the information across the gap in memory. Again, of course, the solipsist can appeal to unmediated laws of experience. This would require, as Schwitzgebel and Moore put it, temporally gappy cross-modal causation from auditory experience at the beginning of the experiment to visual representation later. So that is, there's some sort of law of experience that relates the auditory experience of 147 followed by 145 followed by 375 and so on at one time. So you have that set of experiences at one time. There's some law that relates that experience at one time to the visual presentation of the numbers 147, 145, 375 and so on at a later time. This law will have to be highly sensitive to specific contexts, because obviously there are many circumstances where you might have an auditory experience of the first set of numbers, but then no later visual experience of the numbers. I mean, it's easy to imagine a different sort of experiment where the visually presented numbers are different. So this is going to have to, this law of experience that's happening here, this pattern is a really highly specific pattern. So again, this looks like a very complex and ad hoc hypothesis that's been specifically designed to save solipsism from what's actually a pretty obvious refutation. So Schwitzgebel and Moore present they do give a third experiment. They also present a couple of other possible explanations a solipsist might appeal to, like backward causation. But suffice it to say that their conclusion is that the solipsist's explanations are highly ad hoc. They introduce needless complexity. The much more natural interpretation in these cases is something exists with greater reasoning powers than conscious experience. Something exists that retains information that's not present in conscious experience. So there's something beyond one's own conscious experience. That is the conclusion that they draw. So, I mean, you can see how the general strategy here works, right? The idea is to construct experiments using materials that would be available to a radical solipsist, and then you try to generate evidence of something beyond one's own conscious experience. So using nothing more than what's available in your conscious experience, you can then generate, you can construct experiments which will provide evidence of something beyond conscious experience. Because it might be that you can find patterns in your conscious experience that are much better explained by the existence of something beyond your conscious experience. Again, this doesn't conclusively rule out solipsism, because, I mean, it is logically possible that there just are these patterns in your experience that are really, weird and complex, but it's a poor explanation. So Schwitzgebel and Moore's argument is an instance of inference to the best explanation. Their claim is that the external world hypothesis provides a better explanation for the data than does radical solipsism. The data in experiment 1 is better explained by the presence of something that has greater calculating powers than your own, and so on. Now, I am doubtful that this sort of strategy can actually work against the radical solipsist. I'm going to raise an objection here. So I'm doubtful that this can work even in principle. So in my view, the basic problem with this type of argument is it just seems to beg the question against radical solipsism, because I think that radical solipsism kind of has to just reject inference to the best explanation, or at least this type of inference to the best explanation. I think they have to reject it, and here's why. Suppose that the radical solipsist has some experience, call it E, which they wish to explain. Now, evidently, she can only appeal to some other event in her conscious experience, call it E1, right? So she's saying that E1 explains E. And this requires the assumption that there's some sort of connection between E1 and E, right? I mean, if they're literally just completely unrelated, then, you know, I mean, then E1 isn't going to explain E. So there's some sort of connection between E1 and E, which is doing the explaining here, which is giving us a reason why E has occurred. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that the connection between E1 and E could not have been part of her conscious experience. If it had been, then E would already have been explained and there would be no puzzle to solve. Like if she was already consciously aware of the relation between E1 and E, there would have been no mystery about why E happened, and so she wouldn't be trying to explain anything. I mean, she would already have the explanation. So if you're a radical solipsist, it's like, look, she would have immediately, if you're a radical solipsist and if E1 explains E, then the situation should be that you immediately see E1, E, and the connection between them, and in which case you just would already know the explanation. If she didn't consciously experience the connection between E1 and E, but then she goes ahead and concludes that E1 is the explanation for E, it looks like she's just given up on solipsism. She has concluded that there is something beyond her conscious experience, namely E1's connection to E. I mean, look at it this way, right? Like, inference to the best explanation involves generating multiple alternative hypotheses and weighing them against each other. So in explaining E, the radical solipsist may generate an explanation appealing to E1, an explanation appealing to E2, an explanation appealing to E3, and so on. And then the idea is, okay, you weigh up which explanation is more plausible per the explanatory virtues. But clearly, if all that exists is one's own conscious experience, then you will already have consciously experienced that E1 produced E, while E2, E3, E4, and so on didn't. You would just already know that. So, I mean, one thing you might respond with here is, well, maybe she did consciously experience the connection between E1 and E, but then she just forgot about it. I mean, memory isn't perfect, after all, and there are skeptical arguments indicating that memory isn't trustworthy at all. The trouble with this kind of move, though, is that in order to assess radical solipsism, we have to put aside memory skepticism, right? We noted that radical solipsism needs to allow the reliability of memory of one's own experiences. If memory skepticism is on the table, then obviously there's no point running any of the experiments, because you could never trust that the experiment was run the way it seemed to have run. For example, in experiment 1, right, for all you know, maybe the Excel spreadsheet showing which numbers are prime and non-prime was worked out manually rather than using the Excel program. Like, once you've got to the end of that experiment, you have absolutely no idea, if you are skeptical of your memory, right? If you're a memory skeptic, you just have absolutely no idea how that list of which says prime, non-prime, and so on, how that list was generated. So, I mean, like, you just can't do experiments if you're a memory skeptic. So memory skepticism is off the table. Which means that, look, you don't, now, of course, there may well be some circumstances in which you forget things. I mean, again, memory isn't perfect, and you don't have to be a memory skeptic to think that memory isn't perfect. But the fundamental problem, I suppose, is that you know, there are, if you have enough of it, it's going to be the case that if you have enough of a memory to remember E1 and E together, then you would already have the understanding that E1 produced E, right? So yeah, I think that the radical solipsist is not going to accept inference to the best explanation as a legitimate form of inference. If you're in the explanation game, you're presupposing that radical solipsism is false. Radical solipsism is going to be able to countenance brute facts. There are patterns in experience, but there's nothing that explains those patterns. At least, well, there may be things that explain those patterns, but the point is that in general, there are going to be extremely strict limits on the appropriate application of inference to the best explanation. Inference to the best explanation is not generally truth tracking. The radical solipsists just can't accept that. One point worth keeping in mind here is this point I made earlier about the different approaches to laws of nature. I said that the radical solipsist can only accept a Humean account of laws, so there can only be patterns in experience. There can't be any kind of underlying necessary connection or underlying cause that governs experience. Now, one important aspect of the debate between necessitarian and Humean accounts of laws is a different attitude towards explanation. Because what motivates a lot of necessitarians is that they are unhappy with postulating brute regularities. So a brute regularity like, nothing exceeds the speed of light, or all protons are positively charged. Necessitarians are going to think, no, there has to be like some fundamental explanation for the order in the world. It can't just be that like the world, I don't know, it's just like protons are just positively charged and that's just it. Now, of course, I mean, there are, we now think things beyond protons. Protons are not at the fundamental level, but whatever it is that's at the fundamental level, whatever the fundamental facts are, whatever the fundamental regularities are, right, it can't just bottom out in some brute unexplained pattern. There needs to be laws of nature that explain the regularities. By contrast, Humeans are actually just more comfortable leaving things unexplained, right? Now, most Humeans will think that there are explanations for things. There may well be an explanation for why all protons are positively charged, and this will appeal to the nature of the things that constitute protons. So at that point, we will appeal to quarks or whatever. But that's just an ordinary scientific explanation. At some point, we're going to reach the fundamental level, the fundamental regularities. And, at that point, Humeans are kind of happy to just shrug and say, well, the world just is the way it is. There doesn't need to be any reason for the fundamental things to be the way they are. And, from the Humean point of view, the fundamental laws are just identical to the fundamental regularities, so they don't explain the regularities. With that in mind, then, what would Humeanism look like under radical solipsism? Well, if the radical solipsist is right, then you hit the fundamental level straight away. There's nothing beyond experience. There's nothing more to the way the world is. Experience is not made up of anything, right? So there's nothing further to appeal to by which you could provide an explanation of anything. For instance, I can't, if I have two experiences of the color red, I'm not going to say that these two red experiences are the same color because they have the same underlying structure of fundamental particles or anything like that. There is no underlying structure. There's nothing more than just these two experiences of redness. And all the Humean is going to give you then is, because we hit that fundamental level straight away, that's it. The patterns in experience are all you've got. You can state the Humean laws of such patterns, but there's not going to be any underlying necessary connections or causes or anything like that. So this is just kind of another way of seeing that I think that the radical solipsist is going to be resistant in principle to this kind of explanatory project. I think they have to be resistant to it. Now, of course, it might be responded that this in itself shows that radical solipsism is off the table. So, I mean, Schwitzgebel and Moore argue that the radical solipsist is forced to give a bad explanation. What I'm saying is the radical solipsist basically can't give any explanation at all. But, surely that's even worse. I mean, I now have an even stronger reason to reject radical solipsism, because the radical solipsist can't even help herself to the explanations suggested by Schwitzgebel and Moore. But I mean, the point here, of course, is, look, the solipsist is not accepting inference to the best explanation in general as a legitimate form of inference. If you accept inference to the best explanation, then obviously it's worse to have no explanation at all than it is to have a bad explanation. But if you reject inference to the best explanation, then you're not going to see it as a problem that you don't have an explanation. Explanation is not truth tracking. The radical solipsist explanation, the radical solipsist's rejection of inference to the best explanation is not ad hoc. First of all, there are a number of other philosophers who are not radical solipsists who reject inference to the best explanation. For instance, Bas van Frassen. I've got a bunch of videos which outline some of the general objections to this form of inference, and I will again link that in the comments, such as the bad lot problem. So there are independent reasons to be suspicious of this kind of inference. Second, the radical solipsist rejects inference to the best explanation as a matter of principle, given the commitments of her theory, because the method of this form of inference presupposes that there are certain connections or relations or features of reality beyond what's present in conscious experience. So it's not ad hoc for the radical solipsist to reject this. It's an immediate implication of her theory. And this doesn't mean that she has to give up on epistemic principles in general. I mean, she can still think, for instance, that, well, like one epistemic principle is you favor whatever theory is logically consistent. Like, if I can show that a theory is logically inconsistent with the evidence, then it has to be rejected. So it's not like the radical solipsist is unable to assess hypotheses, but she's not going to accept inference to the best explanation. So if this is right, then I think the experimental strategy can't work. Schwitzgebel and Moore try to treat radical solipsism as a scientific hypothesis and assess it by ordinary scientific standards. I think I'm doubtful that works. I think that assessing it in this way begs the question against it. It's impossible to conclusively falsify radical solipsism by experiments, because such experiments can only show patterns which are best explained by rejecting radical solipsism, but radical solipsism will not accept inference to the best explanation. I think that there's a good case here that science, the scientific approach, arguably presupposes that radical solipsism is false. So, I mean, ultimately, what Schwitzgebel and Moore call the fallback manoeuvres are really the only option. I suppose, though, that if you're attracted to such manoeuvres, this shouldn't be surprising. I mean, if, for instance, solipsism is incoherent, then maybe it's to be expected that there's not really any sensible way of assessing it in terms of inference to the best explanation. There are many philosophers who would argue that certain assumptions must be in place in order to make any rational assessments at all. See, for instance, hinge epistemology. Again, I have a video on hinge epistemology. From that point of view, again, it's hardly going to be surprising that, well, if you're a radical solipsist, then you just can't use, inference to the best explanation, right? This point does generalize beyond solipsism to skepticism more generally. Radical solipsism is one type of skeptical scenario, but there are many skeptical scenarios. If I'm right, then when you perform an inference to the best explanation, you are presupposing from the outset that some skeptical scenarios are off the table. I mean, basically, if inference to the best explanation can't refute radical solipsism, it can't refute skepticism more generally, because radical solipsism is one type of skeptical scenario. Now, that doesn't show that this best explanation stuff can't be part of a response to skepticism, but it does show it can't be a complete response. A complete response might use inference to the best explanation to deal with some skeptical scenarios, like the brain in the vat scenario maybe, but then it's going to require a different strategy to deal with stuff like radical solipsism. Anyway, those were just some thoughts about that article by Schwitzgebel and Moore. It's a very interesting article. You should go check it out, go read it, and you know, that's it. That's the end of that video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.